All right, anybody want to pipe up?
I'll pipe in. Mitchell Brown
Okay.
from University of California, or Irvine. We coordinate across the University of California system with our institutional repository, which we branded eScholarship. We also work with symplectic elements to use that as our harvesting tool, and we have an ORCID integration with that system. So we've done the integration where we can pull data from ORCID, but we can also write back from the publication harvesting system elements into ORCID, those citations as well. If the authors identify ORCID within their symplectic elements profile, the ORCID ID is also appears in the scholarship instance, and then that links within eScholarship, which also links back to the ORCID profile. So it's sort of the front end side of what the OJS system would do is publishing. We capture it when we do deposits post-publishing. And it'll also connect the other formats that people deposit, working papers, conference proceedings, posters, other kinds of publishing objects.
Awesome. Yes, thank you so much, Mitchell. Oops. I'm going to add you to the, oops, it thought that just ignore that. Okay, so Mitchell, you're on the wheel. So yes, that's a great example. So there's a few things to note about this. So the bpress question, this is something that a lot of people have asked, and as of right now, because bpress Digital Commons is a vendor system, they do not have the ORCID API integrated yet. They do have a manual field where somebody can manually type in their ORCID ID into Digital Commons, but it's not connected with the ORCID API, so you can't do the reading and writing of data to and from the ORCID record. But I am told that this is something that bpress is actively working on. And so if you are a bpress user, I would just encourage you to contact bpress and just keep asking them about the ORCID integration, and hopefully they can give us more updates and timelines, but that is something that they are working on. I see some other comments in the chat. Islandora, that's one where because it's open source and it's community driven, I believe that last time I checked, ORCID is on the roadmap. That ORCID API integration is on the roadmap for Islandora. I'm not sure how far they've gotten with it, so that's something where we should probably check back in with the Islandora community. So it kind of varies. If a system is a vendor system, it's really up to the vendor to integrate the ORCID API. If it's an open source system, technically an institution using that system could make changes to the code to integrate the ORCID API, but typically we're relying on a community of users to prioritize development features and stuff for those types of systems like Islandora, like DSpace. I know that ORCID API integration, you know, out of the box is on the roadmap for DSpace. It's just going to be a matter of time for the community to get to that work. I see a comment about Esploro. So that I've heard of that. I believe that's a new system coming from Ex Libris, if I'm not mistaken. And I know we have a few organizations that are kind of like beta testers that are saying that ORCID is in the plans for that system as well. So, you know, there's still some ways to go in terms of having the ORCID API integrated into all of the different repository systems that people are using. But overall, it is a very similar process to publishing systems like we talked about. We do have some really good case studies, actually. A few organizations have done this. So for example, University of Virginia has integrated the ORCID API with their Samvera repository. So this blog kind of takes you through their workflow and how they're having people connect their ORCID ID with their account in the institutional repository, and then writing works from the repository to the ORCID record. So I've got screenshots in here showing how that works. Somebody signs in, they authorize the repository as a trusted organization, and then they can add works to ORCID from the repository. For example, their ORCID ID shows up next to their name in the repository, and here you can see that works are being written. So it's very similar in terms of you can pull information from the ORCID record into the repository if that's what you want to do. And you can take citations from the repository and write those to people's ORCID records. So just an overview there. And ORCID does have pages on how this works in terms of the workflow for repository systems. And there's also a document around recommendations, best practices, basically, for using ORCID in repositories. And that can be an institutional repository, ETDs, data repositories. It kind of all works the same way. Okay, cool. I'm seeing that for the Esploro, oh yeah, and for ProQuest, yeah, so ProQuest ETD submission, they have a manual entry field so people can type their ORCID ID in. That is really not the best practice. Ideally, it would be an authenticated field where somebody would click a button and then be prompted to log into their ORCID record to connect their ORCID ID. But it is thinking in the right direction. If you are using ProQuest ETD, we have an email template where you can contact them and ask them to actually make that field an authenticated field. And that is on our tech support page. I have systems listed here where you can see exactly what they do with ORCID, and there's email templates for contacting vendors and asking them for more ORCID functionality, for example. Okay, not to get too far off track, because I want to make sure we get through at least covering all of the remaining questions. So the next one is about central identity management systems. This is something that is kind of seems to be a trend where institutions are looking at integrating ORCID and the ORCID API with a centralized identity management database. Does anybody have experience with this or have ideas about how this type of integration might work? Going once.
Again, Mitchell Brown, University of California. It has only been in a discussion phase, but because we have 10 campuses plus some affiliated laboratories that are associated with the system, there was a question about using ORCID as a unique identifier for logging in to some of our online systems. It was something that all of the organizations could use because the IDs would be individual for each and authenticated for each user. It was an interesting idea, but we realized that the uptake for registration for ORCIDs wasn't quite there yet. So the population did not necessarily have one. But it was an interesting way of looking at using an existing system to help us with an authentication for either single sign-on or entrance to some of the information systems. And increasingly, I know campuses are starting to look at integrating ORCID into the identity management on campuses so they can track relationships between funding, publication support, equipment related to that support for reporting purposes. Then the Livermore National Laboratory that coordinates work with the University of California, they use ORCID quite extensively because they have a more stringent reporting requirement.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mitchell. That's great. And also I see in the chat from Lori attach the ORCID to the personnel record and institution system. And that is right on. So both Mitchell and Lori, I will add your names to the wheel of names. So the more questions you, I wasn't supposed to spin it just yet, please ignore that. So the more questions you answer, the more times your name can get on the wheel of names. But yeah, basically, most organizations have some sort of centralized database where they're already storing information about all of the people affiliated with that organization, maybe, you know, their organizational email address, other types of information, your organizational identifier. So it's basically just a matter of adding some additional fields to that database where somebody's ORCID ID can get stored next to their institutional ID. So basically linking up their ORCID ID and their institutional ID in that centralized database. So that's kind of like on the back end, what that looks like. On the front end, it's really just a matter of having some sort of user-facing web page. Typically, it's something where people at your institution are already logging in to a certain web page, so it's already verified that they're affiliated with your institution. And then there would be basically a button prompting them to connect their ORCID ID with their institutional ID. And the user goes through that authentication process that we actually covered on the last call. So if you missed that, you will want to go back and look at the recording for that, which is linked on our agenda document. But again, we do have case studies around that, and it's very similar. The central identity management integration is very similar and often overlaps with like a central HR system. So something like PeopleSoft or Banner, Workday, those types of systems often contain a lot more information. And so often those are kind of connected. And there's a lot of different ways that those types of integrations can be set up depending on the systems that you're using. And you usually have to get you know, somebody from central IT on board, or whoever is managing those centralized systems really needs to be on board with those types of integrations. But if you're looking in our ORCID US community exemplars, you'll see that we have a good example from Boston College. Cornell University has a good example. University of Iowa College of Medicine, University of Texas Southwest Medical Center. So there's a lot of examples out there that you can look at. I'll put a link to this exemplars page in the chat just so you can take a look at those if you'd like. And I see that we have somebody, Mason. Certainly, yes, we would love to hear your follow-up question on this. Feel free to unmute or just type it in.
Oh, thank you. I'll mute myself. Yeah, that was really interesting. Talk about that. I know there is the API for integration with the central management, but when I think the Mitchell saying like that can actually link into the reporting, like the federal fundings reporting, like that. Does that mean there's another system linking to this? It's not just one integration. To me, it sounds like there's another piece, another management system, like managing the fundings, research fundings, and that actually linking through the central management system, the ID central management system. Is that? I think I just want to clarify: is there's another system, right?
Correct.
Yeah, go ahead, Mitch.
Yeah, the system is not fully integrated or passed through, but ORCID is used to generate reporting, and it connects with other information systems. My understanding is ORCID will continue to be used for NSF funding supports through the BioSketch program, and also as part of a way of tracking the work. It is an ongoing sort of, as the system progresses, the integration with ORCID as a way of tracking the funding requirements is increasing. But right now, it's a separate system, and they coordinate multiple systems that are not necessarily fully integrated.
Yeah, we are in the middle of a transition from Colli to Workday. So we are like halfway. Our faculty staff is in Workday, student in Colli, and we haven't finished that financial module for Workday. So I just wonder if anybody have a success case, like you integrated the Center ID, which is like Workday system, and then you add the financial piece, so you can like integrate it that way to have the financial reporting inside of Workday with that, or you have another software package putting together. That's kind of my question over there. I know the Workday is modularized, you have different pieces, but I was thinking, is just the Workday will do all the trick, or there's another piece of system need to put in to the place? And I'm from the library, but our Office of Research sponsored the research. They have hard time to finding out where the funding all goes, like use a spreadsheet to deal with all the things. I'm just interested, is there a way ORCID with Workday, if they together, that can make the trick, then that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I don't know of anyone who has done an integration around Workday. I know that Workday does not have the ORCID API built into their software already, but neither does PeopleSoft, neither does Banner. So as far as I know, these common HR systems don't have the API built in. But we have seen success at institutions like Boston College, Lehigh University, and this is kind of an example from UT Southwestern Medical Center where, let me see on this chart. Okay, so they actually have like an enterprise data warehouse, or even just a separate secure database that communicates with, for example, PeopleSoft, but also communicates with ORCID and stores information about ORCID. So it's kind of this additional database where you can have data coming in from your HR system like Workday, and you can have data coming in from ORCID. So potentially you could have, you know, other systems connected into that workflow, but it would really depend on the specific systems that you're using. And, you know, you would need to have all of the stakeholders involved to make sure like any security risks are mitigated and that kind of thing, just making sure that you're, you know, following best practices at your institution. This would also, you would need to have a developer available to kind of work on setting this up and making sure that all the information is flowing between systems in the way that it should. So it's certainly possible to set up kind of a custom integration that utilizes a separate database where you can pull information from multiple systems. It would just take some time to get that set up, to get it running smoothly. And if anyone on the call is interested in doing something like this, I am more than happy and I am available to talk to you on a separate call one-on-one so we can actually look at the specifics of the different systems you're using, how the workflows are already happening, and where ORCID could fit in to make things run smoother. Absolutely. And I'm just putting my email address into the chat if you don't already have it. So feel free to email me if you have more questions or want to set up a call. Awesome, thanks all. Okay, so moving ahead, we're doing really good here. We actually just kind of answered this question because the two are somewhat related. So basically, just to reiterate, around the HR systems like PeopleSoft and Workday and Banner, I know there are more, but those are like the main ones that I've heard of. right now, like I mentioned, they are vendor systems. So ideally, it would be great if those vendors would incorporate the ORCID API directly into their software. But as of right now, that's not the case. And organizations using some of these systems have done custom integrations to get data from HR systems onto people's ORCID records and to link people's ORCID ID with their kind of profile or account in the HR system. Okay, next question that is open for trivia for the Wheel of Names. Does anybody want to speak to how the ORCID API might work with researcher profiles? So I'm thinking about like public-facing pages from a directory or something where you have the person's photo, information about them, that kind of thing. Anybody want to take a gander? All right, I'm seeing in the chat, populate ORCID with Scopus publications. That is certainly something that is possible. I see what you're saying. So basically, like somebody might have a Scopus kind of profile and then they can pull that information into their ORCID record. Is that what you're saying, Gary? Yes. Okay, yeah, absolutely. Scopus author profile. There is a built-in connection between ORCID and Scopus. People can go into their ORCID record and connect their Scopus with ORCID and pull Scopus information onto their ORCID record. That is definitely a valid answer. So, so Gary, I will go ahead and add you to it. So yeah, so that's definitely one way of thinking about it. It wasn't necessarily the use case that I had in mind, but it's totally valid. So yeah, with all the other types of author profiles that are out there on various third-party systems, many of them do connect with ORCID. Researcher ID is another one. My brain is kind of blanking right now, but there are other researcher profiles out there that people can connect with their ORCID ID, absolutely. One of the use cases I was thinking about here is like at your organization, if your organization is also giving people faculty profile pages or that kind of thing, you can leverage the ORCID API for that. One thing that you can do that you see here is if you have authenticated ORCID IDs for your researchers, you can just simply display that ORCID ID so that anybody looking at this profile could click on that ORCID ID and be linked out to the person's ORCID record and see more information about them. Depending on how the integration is set up, technically all of this additional information like the biography and selected works, this information could technically be imported from the person's ORCID record if they have that information filled out in their ORCID record. So a couple of things to remember here, like Gary mentioned, and I see Mason is also mentioning Pivot. So yeah, Pivot is integrated with ORCID, so you can connect your Pivot profile to your ORCID record. So you can connect an ORCID ID to multiple kind of third-party profile systems. And if you have your own local researcher profile pages like you're seeing here, you can integrate that with ORCID. So you can pull data in from ORCID, you can display the ORCID ID, that kind of a thing. I think they're also doing something very similar to this at North Carolina State University too. Question, if someone has their profile private, can you still import? That's a great question, Brian. I think most people probably already know, but if you don't, researchers do have the ability to change the visibility settings of their entire ORCID record and all of the granular pieces of data on the ORCID record. Those visibility settings are basically public, private, and trusted parties only. If somebody has any information in their ORCID record set to the private setting, then it doesn't matter if they've connected their ORCID ID with your system, you're never going to be able to get that private information. So private does mean it's completely private to that person. It doesn't matter what organizations they've connected their ORCID ID with. So the data either needs to be set to public or trusted parties in order for your system to pull that data in, as long as the person has authorized that connection with their ORCID ID. Does that answer? Does that make sense? So basically, once a person connects their ORCID ID with your API integration, that designates your organization as a trusted party. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, if it's set to trusted parties and they've connected their ORCID ID and granted that permission, then you can import it. One other thing you have to do though, you have to make sure that you use, you have to indicate that you want to ask them for permission to read their information that's set to trusted parties only. So yeah, that is totally doable. Okay, doing good. All right, and I think this is kind of our last question around how ORCID works with kind of specific systems or specific workflows. This one can be interpreted in a couple of different ways, but basically this is a question about how the ORCID API works with single sign-on. So if anybody thinks they might have kind of an answer to this, pipe up and let us know. Going once? Going twice?
Sure, Mitchell Brown again.
Awesome.
Sorry, I'm trying not to dominate, but we do have an example. So, University of California, Irvine, we have the option to use the institutional login, single sign-on protocol in order to log into the ORCID accounts. And the first time you use that system, there is the trusted partner recognition. And then after that, we find that the users, if they only have to remember one login protocol, that's the one that they use. And that's my understanding of how it works with
nice.
Authorization.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a valid and correct answer. Oh no, it keeps thinking that I'm spinning it. Just ignore that. We're not ready to spin yet. Okay, yeah, absolutely. So when somebody goes to log into their ORCID record, and actually they just, like 2 days ago, they just made some adjustments to the way this looks. So it's a little bit new. They can either sign in or they can sign in using their institutional credentials. So access through your institution. If you click on that, you can look for your organization's name. Most universities in the US are already set up to do this because it's set up through EduGain. And if your organization is a member of In Common Federation, which most US universities are, this should already be set up. If it's not working at your organization, there might be just a slight tweak that you might need to make on your end, because ORCID does require that you're releasing a certain attribute in order for this to work. But people can sign into their ORCID record using their institutional credentials. You'll note that they can also sign in using their Google or their Facebook. So there are a couple ways that people can sign into ORCID. Kind of like a single sign-on. There's also a workflow where people can sign into other systems using their ORCID credentials. So ORCID does have a documentation on how to set that up. This might not be super helpful to many of you because you are probably at a university and you probably are having people log into your systems using their university credentials. But for organizations that maybe have people from multiple institutions that want to log into a system, ORCID is a really good way to do that because it's universal, and people don't have to have yet another username and password they have to remember. They can just use ORCID to sign into a website. That can be set up, and actually this can be set up using the public API. It doesn't have to be a member API. So just an FYI on that. Okay, let's see. What is our next question? What systems do institutions typically integrate first? Does anybody want to take a guess at the answer?
This is Lori, and I'll guess research administration systems, even if I'm wrong.
You know what, though, Lori? I think that's a really good answer, and that's right. I'm going to add you to the list. Oops. It keeps thinking I've sent it. Okay. Research information systems. That is a great answer. And as the first person to pipe up, I'm considering that a correct answer. And the reason is, I mean, it does vary a little bit, but in general, if we're looking at trends, a lot of the research information systems like Pure, Digital Measures, Faculty 180, Symplectic Elements, those vendor systems, all of those have the ORCID API already built in with functionality to varying degrees, but that makes it much easier for an organization to just go ahead and turn on that integration that already exists. So it takes a lot less planning when you have a vendor system that has the ORCID API built in, because then you can just turn the integration on. You don't actually need a developer to do, you know, all of the integration work for a custom integration, for example. So so that is definitely kind of what I would consider a low-hanging fruit. If your institution is already using a vendor system that has the ORCID API built in, most of those are research information management systems. So I think that is definitely a correct answer. And Lori says in the chat that it's often easier to get those vendors to do the integration than the big HR or personnel systems. And I think that's right on too. So in most cases, it is the vendor systems that already have the API built in. Some institutions that are using a lot of custom systems or open source systems and maybe aren't using these vendor products, the common approach that I've been seeing at those types of institutions is they're looking at like the central identity management integration first, so then they can connect multiple systems in with that existing integration, with that custom centralized integration. So it does vary a little bit across the board, but again, because ORCID is so configurable, it really does depend on the specific systems that you're using at your organization. Where can I find the list of research information systems? Oopsie. I will paste a link in. So on our ORCID US community website, we have a technical support page that lists a bunch of common systems. It will have more than just the research information system, but the list is alphabetical, so you can scroll down on this list and try to find systems that you're using. So basically what I have is common systems for ORCID integration, and then it lists all the different systems with some explanation of how it works, what the status is basically, if it's possible to do a custom integration, or what the status is. And then there's some common vendor systems that don't support ORCID yet, so those are separated out. But for all of these, we do have email templates where you can contact the vendor to ask them for ORCID API integration. And then we also list out some other kind of third-party platforms that are already integrated with ORCID themselves that your researchers might be using. Let's see. Okay, cool. So let's see, what's our next question? Oh, just this is just going with the previous slide. These are all the different types of systems that are typically integrated with ORCID. I'll share these slides too afterwards, so you can have these links that are down at the bottom too. But we've covered just about almost all of these in our FAQs around how the API works with these. So this is just to give you an idea of the types of systems that are common candidates for ORCID integration. And this is a screenshot of what I just showed you on the web. All right, here's our next question. How to leverage the ORCID API across multiple systems? And we touched on this a little bit, but does anybody want to speak and potentially get your name on the wheel? Going once, going twice. All right. So leveraging the ORCID API across multiple systems, it is possible. If you're at a university, which if anybody on the call is not at a university, please type into the chat what kind of organization you're at, because I also want to make sure that nobody's getting left out in terms of most of our members are universities, but we do have some other types of organizations like funders and other research institutes. So like we mentioned, all those different types of systems, it's really a good idea to kind of do an inventory across campus of what systems are being used, what stakeholders might need to be involved, because ORCID can really benefit an entire organization, not just one unit or another. That said, this is kind of one of the best graphics that I have for describing how you could possibly leverage one of your member API credentials to get value around ORCID in actually multiple systems. And again, this does depend on the specific system that you're using. But this example here is showing a central identity management system that is integrated with the ORCID API. So you have ORCID IDs and access tokens going into a database in this identity management system. And because those ORCID IDs are authenticated, they can then be sent to other systems that might need to have that ORCID number. So if you have a research information system that is not one of the vendors that's already doing the authentication, or if you're using an open source repository, that kind of thing, you can take an authenticated ORCID ID from a different system and send it to another system. So I think, Mitchell, you had mentioned that University of California, has symplectic elements, which is integrated with the ORCID API. So you're collecting authenticated ORCID IDs through symplectic elements, but then you can take those authenticated ORCID IDs and push them to your repository, for example. Is that right, Mitchell?
Correct.
Yeah. So that's perfectly valid. You can take ORCID IDs that have been authenticated. That's really the most important piece, is making sure that the ORCID IDs that you have were collected through the authentication process. Once they're authenticated, you can display those ORCID IDs really in any system. And depending on the permissions that you ask for in that initial integration where you're collecting that ORCID ID, you'll have an access token for each person that will allow you to do things like pull data from their ORCID record into another system, or take data from another system and write that to the ORCID record. So there are a lot of possibilities for how you can do this kind of leveraging one ORCID API integration to serve multiple different systems. It really just depends on the specific systems that you're using. Oh, I'm just seeing a chat. Encourage authors to opt in to auto updates so new publications from Scopus can flow through ORCID to Pivot. And that is another really good point, Gary. So your comment is kind of more about these other systems that are already existing, as opposed to the systems that your institution is managing. So absolutely, because that counts as well in the grand scheme of how to leverage the ORCID API across multiple systems. And it really points to the whole idea behind ORCID, is to have interoperability between multiple systems, with ORCID as kind of this central hub or linchpin through which data can flow. So, so I'll take your comment as another correct answer for this question about leveraging ORCID across multiple systems. So it's not just systems within your institution, but you can encourage your researchers to make sure that they're connecting their ORCID ID with other third-party integrations like Scopus, like Pivot. Basically, the more your researchers can use their ORCID ID and connect it to the systems that are integrated with ORCID, the more everyone can benefit with that interoperability and data flow. So I'll turn into the wheel just to spice things up. Oh, shoot, keeps doing that, sorry. Okay, I realize we are running out of time. We have about 5 minutes left. I see another chat. When you ask permission, you should be asking on behalf of the institution, not a particular system like the IR. So actually that is very much up to you and how you want to set that up. The question of who is asking for permission to connect with the user's ORCID ID, that really comes down to when you get your API credentials, what did you put as the client name? So you can, so for example, if you're doing an integration with your central ID management system or like a central HR system, you probably just want to have the name of your institution. But if it's a specific like OJS journal, or if it's your institutional repository, you can either put the name of just the name of the organization, or you can put the name of the repository or the name of the journal. It's really up to you and your organization how you want that to appear. But overall, the organization is the ORCID member. So even if it's a system that, let's say it's your IR specifically, it's the IR of that institution. So it's all really granting permission to the institution, but you can specify in the integration the client name that you want to appear when you're asking the researcher for permission. So the client name could be like Scholars Bank IR, or it could be University of Oregon, or it could be University of Oregon Institutional Repository. So that part is really up to you in terms of how you want that to be presented to your researchers. So since we are running out of time, I'm gonna just see if we can get through maybe 1 or 2 more questions, and then we'll spin the wheel. Oh, I'm seeing another question in the chat. Topic for another day, but creating IDs for organization members versus individuals. Can we do that? Definitely contact me if you want to talk more about this, but to very quickly answer that, only individuals can get ORCID IDs. Organizations cannot have an ORCID ID. There are other types of identifiers.
I'm sorry. Just to clarify, Sheila,
Yeah,
I was talking about like as an organization, like a university, like creating ORCID IDs for like all of our researchers without their feed in.
Yeah, that's a great question, because when ORCID first got started, there was kind of a pilot project with certain universities where they created ORCID IDs for all of their researchers.
Yes.
But that actually
went
didn't
well.
work out. It didn't work out. So now ORCID does not allow organizations to create IDs for individuals. The individual themselves has to register for their own ORCID ID. Long story short. So thank you for that question, because that is
okay.
Another
Thank you. I had it in the back of my mind, and like something. It was either MIT or Harvard that like things went like south with it.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. That's right. So good question. Thank you. Okay, this I think will be our final question for today, which is a common one. And it is, what type of technical expertise and resources are needed for an institution to integrate systems with ORCID? Does anybody want to take this last chance to get your name on the wheel of names before we do a spin? In the interest of time, I will count down. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so this question about, well, what kind of expertise do we need? What kind of resources do we need? It varies. I've heard, so for custom integrations, you definitely need at least one developer. And then from there, it kind of varies in terms of like how long that would take, because some developers are already familiar with OAuth, which is what the ORCID API is based on. And so they could get it set up in like a week. Other times, if there's other projects that somebody is working on, it could take several months. So this question is kind of like, there's no wrong answer, but there's also no one right answer. It really just depends on what systems you're looking at integrating. Like we mentioned, the vendor systems that already have the ORCID API functionality built in, you really don't need technical expertise. You just need somebody to basically turn on that integration. So that's another place where I can help and consult with you around your specific systems. To see kind of how long that might take, what resources you might need, that kind of thing. I know we're right at the hour, so if you have to go, sorry, just ignore that. Okay, this is going to be the official spin to see who our winner for this call is, and let's click and spin. This is the official spin now. All right, it looks like Brian is our winner. So Brian, I will get in touch with you directly, your special prize. But thank you so much, everyone who did participate and answer questions. And it looks like we still did not get through all of them. We only got through this many, so I may go ahead and schedule another follow-up at part 3 to address the rest of the questions. And definitely feel free to add questions to this doc as well, if you have more questions that you want answered. Thank you all so much. I hope that was helpful. I hope you learned something new today. So just stand by for the part 3 call, and hopefully I'll see everyone there. Thank you so much. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. I gotta stop recording.
Thank you.
And stay tuned. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for participating.